I am super excited about this training today. It's something that's a goal I think we've had for a while in PPACG is to provide more transportation for our, not only our elected officials, but our staff and different people that are interested in what we do. And so this is exciting. This is kind of like our first one. So that's why it's called 101, right?
That is correct, Madam Chair, members of the board. We're going to kind of go over transportation, but it obviously, apparently, when I hit 120 slides, that was too much. So I was instructed that
Yeah, I'm a 5 slide lady myself.
yeah, I had to pull back. So we're not going to cover things like transit, which I think there would be a lot of interest in, especially since within the urbanized boundary, there are certain things you do and don't do versus outside that boundary. So I think that would be very interesting, especially since a lot of the questions that Laura had received. So I think one of our future, maybe 102, Laura will come back and do some transit, and I'll probably have a part of it, given my experience in transit. I do have some knowledge, maybe not as deep as hers, on the overall transit planning. Additionally, I think another question people have, and this is advanced, like master's level class, like a 402, would be the model and modeling. And we'll do that at a later date. So this is just, again, the 101, kind of the basics, trying to cover the difference between the two. So with that, let me go ahead and continue to drone on here about that. So I think those of you who have lived through any of my presentations before know that I think I sort of have the military way of making presentations beat into me. So it's tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you just told them, right? So what we're going to cover today is this is a presentation we had from before. I think you all know who PPACG is. So those slides will go through real quickly. The geography of transportation planning. And that's the one thing I've sort of picked on in my 5 years here is there's a lot of ways that Colorado has cut up the pie. And sometimes if you have a lot of the different districts overlaid on each other, that gives you a little bit of advantage because you're very uniform in your point of view. Pikes Peak region is not that way. We have a lot of different boundaries sort of cut us and dissect us. So we have to all sort of be on the same page before we move into a lot of these meetings. And so we'll cover that. Where does the funding come from? We'll touch on that. Spoiler alert, the funding comes from you, the taxpayer, right? Just so everybody's on the same page there. But it's how the process, where it comes from your pocket back to projects like roads and et cetera. We'll touch on the last long range plan, the 2045, and then we'll also hit the 2050. Danelle is going to take care of that because she's going to be our staff point of contact for the 2050 long range plan. And then I have a few things in there about the value of an efficient network. So moving on, this is all about you, the PPACG. And again, I think you know all of this stuff. The board of directors might be someone that oh wait, that's you. Okay. Again, this is all of our members. And again, hopefully you see yourself listed here someplace. But here's the first boundary map that we'll share. So, and again, you've got the COG boundary, which is sort of this, this is the outside Park, Teller, and El Paso. And then within that, you've got the NPO boundary, which is the Metropolitan Planning Organization, which is a federal designation required of any urbanized area as outlined by the census of 50,000 or more has to create a metropolitan planning organization in cooperation with the state, and it ultimately needs the governor's approval. So PPACG has been around, what was it, Jared, what, 55 years? Oh, there you are, okay. So obviously we've been around for a while. And then you've got the different municipal boundaries within there. So there's different things that happen at the different layers of planning. Before I hit the next slide, oh, too late, I already hit it. But I just want to make sure everybody knows that this is a very informal presentation. Feel free to interrupt me. I'm happy to go down a rabbit hole on something if you'd like. But that being said, I'll cut the time back someplace else to make sure. Huh? Oh, all right. To stay within the transportation thing, I'm happy to go down the potholes with you. So feel free to just go ahead and it is Colorado, so the double entendre of pot. I get it. Okay. All right. So so feel free to interrupt if you have any questions. But here's sort of the main thrust of our presentation, or that is geography
John,
matters.
Could,
Right?
could I ask, the MPO boundaries, are those kind of, I know it includes Colorado Springs, are they kind of arbitrary other than that, or they were just sort of, let's get out a little ways from Colorado Springs to account for growth and we'll draw the lines there?
That's basically right. But that is a great question. And I say it's a great question because I actually have slides on that coming up. So we did not plan this, but we actually have that. But you're absolutely right. It's basically based on the urbanized boundary plus the growth that that it's reasonably expected by the time you get to the next one. So that way they don't expect to just draw a line and say, you're done, but you draw a line and you say, okay, what's our reasonable expectation of densities of growth and density out there, and then you smooth the boundary and redraw it. But Will's going to come up for about 10 slides. That's going to cover exactly that here in a few minutes.
Thanks.
So first, and again, this presentation will be available to anybody. That's why it's a little on the text heavy side, so you can go back and read it later. I don't think we have the time or you guys have the patience for me to read to you because you can read for yourself. But the first is the 15 TPRs, and we just had a discussion about the different TPRs. Here in Colorado, the first 5 TPRs are the metropolitan planning organizations. Again, those that have the density high enough to trigger the federal requirement for an MPO. So TPR regions 1 through 5 are the state's 5 MPOs, and then 6 through 15 are the rural TPRs. If you're an MPO, you have some autonomy of being able to make some decisions for yourself and doing some stuff. While if you're in the TPRs, that process is run through CDOT. You still have some say, but ultimately it's that CDOT process that you're engaged in. While here at the MPO level, you have the ability to control that process as well. So there's a lot more autonomy there at the MPO level. I think I stole this off the internet, and the little factoid is there's like 450 different urbanized areas all over the United States. But you can see basically the major population centers, you get an MPO, everything else is usually covered by something else, and it depends state by state. Here in Colorado, we have TPRs, but if you were in Arizona, for example, it would be something completely different. We've already sort of touched on this map, so I'm not going to go over it again. But again, it's within our area, we've got Park, Teller, and El Paso, and the MPO is that urbanized area with sort of that saguaro arm, cactus arm going up to Woodland Park, catching Green Mountain Falls along the way. So if you're in that sort of blue shaded area, you're in the MPO boundary and you have that MPO process. Meanwhile, if you're outside of that, both eastern El Paso County, the rest of El Paso County, Teller, and Park, you are in the Central Front Range TPR. Okay, I thought I heard something. I'm sorry. All right, so again, back to sort of how the divisions are drawn. So we've got the MPO, and again, that's by federal regulation. So it's 23 CFR 450, I think. It basically says by federal regulation, it's prescriptive. If you have this, you must do that. So it's not something you can sort of opt out of. Now, what you can do is obviously, if your area gets big enough to be an MPO and you're close enough to another MPO, you could just make one giant MPO, right? You don't necessarily have to have 2 separate ones right next to each other. But for the most part, you're going to be creating your own MPO. A TPR, again, that is developed by the state of Colorado regulation. And we had that part of our legislative discussion today. Again, that's prescriptive on how those boundaries are done. Council of Governments, on the other hand, that's a voluntary organization that's defined by its membership. So you all, again, 55 years ago, all decided we have enough in common. Park, Teller, El Paso counties, we're going to be a council of governments, and we're going to voluntarily come together to address some of our issues. And then finally, I have on here, just because I assumed it would come up, maybe I'm wrong, and I'm giving you more information than you want, but the Pikes Peak Rural Transportation Authority, when PPRTA was formed, it used the legislature called it rural. It's now become they've changed it to regional, but our documentation, when we came into existence, it was still rural. So again, it's permissible by the Colorado revised statutes, and it's completely voluntary. That's why you have some in and some out. And then we have the handy dandy 3DI, as I like to call it, that sort of gives you the where folks are. So all of you within all of the different municipalities and counties are within the COG. That's why it's one big giant black circle that covers everybody. There are some that are in the Central Front Range TPR only. Then there's some that are in the Central Front Range TPR, but also members of PPRTA. Then there's the jurisdictions that are in the MPO only, and then the jurisdictions that are in the MPO and PPRTA. So that kind of gives you sort of the breakdown of the different geographies at play here. I'm going to take a little deep breath, make sure I'm not saying anything that's weird. Everyone's cool. All right. All right, we're going to go back. The boundary doesn't go out that far, right? Okay. So yeah, the El Paso, part of El Paso County is in the MPO and part of El Paso County is out of the MPO. Callahan's part of the outside of the MPO boundary. Oh.
Okay, and whenever you guys keep them presented just before, showed the county on the very top part of that. That's my understanding.
One observation too is we may want to include on the slide in an update under the Central Front Range TPR that El Paso County is part of that as well.
Oh, that's
It would double list them,
Yeah,
but
we
same
can
with
double list them.
Teller County too.
they're
It's
they're in three,
confusing.
aren't they?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. We'll try to keep it simple, but yeah. All right. So moving on, Will, yeah, come on up. So first is we're going to talk about the MPO boundary, and Will's going to take the next couple of slides. And again, there's a very specific sort of rule set. Again, 23 CFR 450-312 metropolitan planning boundaries that says how we determine where those lines fall. So Will, take it away.
Hello, my name is William Mast. I'm with Pikes Peak Area Council of Governments. I'm just going to talk a little bit about some of the geographies involved with the MPO and the urbanized area. And as John was just mentioning, how is the MPO boundary determined? Really, the minimum boundary for any MPO when you have a population over 50,000 is to cover the urbanized area as defined by the Census Bureau. And then what we're going to see is we actually take it a little bit further because the FHWA, who funds a lot of our MPO activities here, also has a say in how to define an urbanized area. And so we have to consider that as well. We can move on to the next one. Am I? Great. All right. So
That's a motorcycle, so it's going to go really fast.
yeah. When we're looking at the urban area as the census defines it, that every 10 years when we have our census, sometimes those urban areas not only get updated in terms of the geography, the extent, but also the criteria of what qualifies as urban. And that's exactly what happened this last time in 2020. There was a lot of discussion with the Census Bureau about changing the definition of urbanized area. In fact, the original definition that was proposed would have ended up excluding Woodland Park, for example, from the urbanized area. It would have been cut off, whereas previously it had been included. And so there was a lot of discussion back and forth with the Census Bureau, the MPOs, and a lot of planners around the country. And the census made several updates and changes throughout that process. And they've settled on a final definition of what's going to constitute an urbanized area for the 2020 census numbers. And that's actually what's on your screen here. We are looking at least 2,000 housing units or at least 5,000 persons. And with that definition, our urban area does not shrink. Several MPOs, we're really going to potentially lose some urbanized area. Some did. Our area, we did not see any decrease. Woodland Park is still considered urban. We still have the same corridor going down Ute Pass. So the little cactus arm that John mentioned earlier is going to persist for us. But again, I mentioned FHWA has a say in this as well. What the FHWA, as the Federal Highway Administration, likes to do is take the census urban area, and the census urban area is based on census blocks, which are relatively small units. And sometimes those blocks can look very pixelated or disjointed. And what the FHWA likes to do is come up with, they call this smoothed or adjusted urbanized area. So what they want is they don't want to see the urbanized area necessarily look like small little patches of census blocks. Instead, they'd like it to follow major roadways. And again, that's why it has that smoothed appearance, as they call it. And so they have adjusted urbanized area boundaries. Previously, they were based on, again, the census, but they've modified it a little bit. Instead of having a minimum of 2,500 people, which is what the previous census definition was of an urban area, they've already said it has to be at least 5,000 people. So this FHWA boundaries changed, not just in the sense that it was smoother and typically went out to encompass more major roadways around the urbanized area, but also smaller pockets that had previously been included were sometimes dropped. We are expecting that the FHWA will once again adjust their definition since the Census Bureau has updated theirs. So with the Census Bureau now also considering at least 5,000 people, that already lines up with what FHWA like to consider. FHWA might consider that going forward, but might drop the small urban area and the urban area definition and might just call it all urbanized area. Is one thing that is being considered. So we are waiting now on FHWA to come out with their final criteria before we can go ahead and proceed with any updates. Right now, the census has done their update to the urbanized area definition. FHWA will do theirs by the end of this year. And once we have that updated definition, then we look at our maps and we'll go ahead and see if we need to make changes to our MPO boundary. So on this map, what you have in yellow is the census urban area that's based on the 2010. We do not have an updated 2020 map yet. We only have it in a tabular form. We have not come out with new actual boundaries yet, so that should be forthcoming. But again, we're not looking at losing any urban area with the census, the new census definition. And what you see in purple is where the smooth or adjusted FHWA urbanized area. So again, we took that 2010 census urbanized area definition that's in yellow. And then after the last census, we went through with the FHWA definition, smoothed it out, and that gets you a little bit more area that constitutes urbanized area according to the FHWA definition. And then that blue polygon is your MPO boundary. So we can see that all of the urbanized area falls within the MPO boundary, sometimes right up against it, but it's all in there. And this is available online where you guys can zoom in and turn the map layers on and off and set transparency and explore this in more detail if you'd like. We do have this on our website. So with the MPO area, what we are expecting is once we do get the final extents of the updated 2020 and then eventually the smoothed urbanized area, we would expect it to grow a little bit more out east, up north along the Powers corridor where we have Wolf Ranch and Cordera neighborhoods to be included. We would expect to see it fill in also down south by Fountain because of all the growth that they've had, as well as just in southern Colorado Springs and some areas out towards the southeastern section of the MPO. When we get those boundaries, we are currently anticipating that we might need to make adjustments to the MPO boundary in that area along Fountain. So when you, right now, it's very small sliver that you can see that follows I-25, and then it follows a small intermittent creek on the on the eastern boundary there of that southern leg of the MPO. And what we'll probably do is again, depending on what we come out with the FHWA, again, adjusted or smooth urbanized area boundary, is look at expanding that section. That's where we would see considerable growth that we would want to ensure in the future for Fountain, and make sure that it stays included in the MPO. And right now, we actually have some development going on down there that is actually extending pretty darn close to the MPO boundary. So that's the one area that we've already kind of earmarked. But again, once we have the finalized boundaries from the FHWA, we will look at it in detail and bring it back before our committees and of course the board.
So we're still not quite to Callahan with the MPO boundary.
No, we're not so Kelly. No. Are there any questions at all about that process? About census urbanized area definition, what we do with the FHWA, or what we'll do after that when we talk about making MPO boundary adjustments?
Just to state something I think is pretty clear. The census urban area does not follow city boundaries. It can extend out beyond, it can be less than the city boundaries, like BLR is not part of the census urban area, I don't think.
That is correct. Municipal boundaries are seen more of administrative boundaries as opposed to population boundaries. And so when we look at the MPO, we really don't consider municipal boundaries, just like the urbanized area doesn't consider municipal boundaries. Instead, we're strictly looking at the population area and trying to look at, regardless of how it's administered, whether it's unincorporated or incorporated, what is the population distribution and density within a region, and are we capturing what we would consider the urban or growth areas within the MPO?
Do you know, is this kind of definition of urban used to define the WUI and other states, wildland urban interface?
In
'Cause
most,
that's a big question.
yes, in most cases where we have a definition, whether it's for transit or what we have to do here with the MPO, when they define urban, they'll either define it as, depending on the funding source, FHWA's definition of urban, or they'll oftentimes call out what's called a UZA, which is the census urbanized area.
Specifically about wildland urban interface, though, is this used, do you know, to define that in other states? Or do you just not know? That's okay.
I'm
if
not
you don't.
sure.
Okay.
I'm not sure how it works in other states. So,
Stop the panel, we're gonna flip one of the cards.
yes, sir.
You said the area. Okay, whenever we look at some of the census reports for Callahan area, okay, well, we go by the zip code, not just by the town, city boundaries.
Mhm.
Okay, and if that would be the case, then our area surpasses more than the minimum requirement there. Our zip code is big.
Sure.
So did you guys look at the zip code, or you look at the town municipality?
Neither. For urbanized area, it's based on density is really the big thing. So how many people do you have per mile, per square mile? How many households are there? Vacancy rate, and there's a bunch of other considerations that go into that in the Census Bureau. We do not use zip codes for tabulation.
And just to kind of build on that a little bit, I don't know if it's possible to flip back to that map, but I mean, we do have the saguaro cactus arm that goes up, US 24 to Woodland Park, but that's more justified. That is justifiable because of the population density that we have sort of along the way. There's enough population concentrations there to take in, say, Woodland Park and Green Mountain Falls, but then going out to the northeast area between where the boundary stops now, where the 24 insignia is, and then out to Callahan, we don't see that population, correct? Is that one of the driving factors as to why there can't be an arm that goes out to Callahan?
Yes, and the Census Bureau has, when they come out with this, they actually have definitions on what they would call jumping. And that was one of the reasons why we thought Woodland Park might actually get excluded, is because they said Woodland
Contiguous,
Park
yeah.
maybe doesn't have quite the density that they wanted to initially come out with. And because there's a gap between Woodland Park and then the urban center around Colorado Springs, they didn't want to have that jumping where you've got this urban center, but then you've got this small pocket that might qualify, but it's separated by a distance. And so that was one of the fights that we had with the Census Bureau to keep that included. So in this case, looking at out towards Callahan, or really the MPO boundary out there by Peyton Highway. Obviously, Falcon is developed, it's growing, it meets the criteria. We have the density that the Census Bureau set forth, as well as the minimum population out there. But as you get away from Falcon and move up 24, it doesn't meet any of the criteria that the Census Bureau has set up. So that's why it's not going to be included in an urbanized area boundary. And the FHWA, when it gets adjusted, also will not include it. Right.
Maybe 100 feet. And then it's going to affect my way of getting funding for grants from my town.
Mhm.
And what, hopefully we, part of the group member of the El Paso County. That's right.
So even though El Paso County is an MPO member, El Paso County only can use the MPO funds for projects that lie within the MPO boundary. So El Paso County can't come and say, we're using our El Paso County card to bring some money to Callahan. The feds have very specific rules of that for not only the transportation funding, surface transportation block grant funds, which we'll talk about in a little bit, but also for transit.
Right.
So it's the way the feds have defined the rules. Let's say what matters is where the project is located, not who owns the project. For example, like CDOT obviously has a lot of cachet, a lot of population, but even state facilities that run outside the MPO follow under a different set of rules other than the CDOT projects that fall within the MPO. Sorry. But thanks for drinking the fritters.
I have kind of a tangential question. Relative to the map that you have displayed here, I was wondering from the standpoint of the Front Range passenger rail plan that's coming up, I was wondering how the anticipated tax jurisdiction for that project correlates with this map here. Are they the same, similar, or completely different?
Go ahead.
Completely different. The Front Range passenger rail map was defined in state of Colorado legislation. So what they had said was for these particular counties, and I forget, I think it's 5 miles within I-25 of your MPO, only within the MPO. And then it said for other counties, it's the entire one. So they defined the geography of the Front Range passenger rail district specifically in the legislation. So it had nothing to do with anything else. In fact, even if the MPO, the only thing that could change is if the MPO boundary changes and grows, and it is still within that 5 mile buffer as written in the legislation, then that area would fall, new area would fall into the Front Range passenger rail district. But the rail district itself is defined by the state, and the legislation has nothing to do with this. Ours is a more, again, federally prescribed scientific process based on population densities. So therefore, there might be some change, but one doesn't necessarily feed off the other.
Right.
Thank you.
Where we might see that come into play, again, building on what John said, is again, if we talk about in the future, potentially changing the MPO boundary. And so again, we haven't come up with anything definitive yet. We're still waiting, obviously, on the final geography from the census and then afterwards from the FHWA. But when that does come in, the one thing that we've kind of already eyeballed is, as I mentioned earlier, the southern side of the MPO and potentially expanding this along the boundary of Fort Carson, especially with a potential spur line coming in for Fountain and projected growth in that area for development. It would make sense to go ahead and say that the MPO boundary would probably want to encompass that because it is growing so fast down there. And if that were the case, then because it's within 5 miles of I-25 and then would now be in part of the MPO, it would now be included in that.
All right.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks, Will. And then moving on, next was the, again, the TPRs, but actually we've had a already very robust discussion about TPRs at the last meeting, so I'm not going to go into it. But again, we just wanted to make sure everybody knew that there was this other sort of geography. And again, while you see some folks like Pueblo have sort of this duplication of boundaries and therefore they're probably all on the same page, we sort of split out, right? Our MPO is different than our two different TPRs, and we have some folks outside the COG that's a member of the Central Front Range. So there is that sort of thing where we again have to be sort of unified and understand and chat about things, while other sort of areas don't necessarily have to go through that, because they're very, hopefully I'm using the word right, homogeneous, right? They have a whole bunch of designations, but it's all the same area, so they're all on the same page. We here aren't fortunate enough to have that. Next, I wanted to touch on transportation districts. Again, this is where they've drawn the line a little different, although we are fortunate that we do have Commissioner Hickey in both Park, Teller, and El Paso County. So from that perspective, that's very positive. But again, even then we're, I don't want to say fractured, but we have that extra sort of thing with Fremont County being included.
Who appoints the transportation commissioners, John?
So my understanding of the process is that the governor appoints the transportation commissioner for the 14, well, I guess the 11 different areas, excuse me. I got confused with another one, for the 11 different areas. And then they go through a confirmation process, I believe at the Senate. I don't think it has to go through both. But I believe it's the Senate. And so once they're confirmed, and then they can sit for 4 years. And I believe they are term limited after 2 terms or 8 total years.
Does the governor usually switch them all out when a new governor comes in if it's governor of a different party, or do they generally just keep going with what they've got?
I think we've had a situation here with Rocky Scott, but I believe technically when he was not invited back, to be politically correct, was in that his term was officially sort of up and he was going through that confirmation process. So the governor just pulled his confirmation packet. So I don't think anything happened other than that. So once they're in, I think they're in, but of course the governor can probably make strong recommendations that, you really don't want to hang around here anymore. But I don't believe that they can actually quote unquote fire them, but I'm not an expert in that. So if someone has something different, you guys have been in the state a lot longer than I have, feel free to let me know.
All right, thanks.
All right. And then we've got Colorado Department of Transportation regions. Wanted to touch on this because again, what's the value of this talk? It's where do you go to get solutions? Who has authority to do what? And so this is in here to sort of stress that poor Shane that was being beat up over the last week. He is the director for Region 2. So you can see while we're very fortunate that he spends a lot of time with us here at Park, Teller, El Paso County for our COG meetings, he actually has this whole geographic area that he has to look after. Pueblo has their own MPO, so they probably have a lot of pull with them, but then there's these other things. So when we talk about funds that come into the region, and then in our case, it's Region 2, like Regional Priority Program or RPP is something you may have heard before, right? When those RPP dollars come in, it's got to cover this whole geographic area. So again, I think that's important to notice that our area very big and Area 1, we're kind of small, but again, they get their portion, we get our portion. Within Region 2, there's a rule that the MPO, that urbanized area, gets, I think, about 20% of the Region 2 funds. So, and then the rest is sort of distributed there. So again, that's part of that decision-making process and understanding that when we talk about Region 2 RPP or Region 2 maintenance dollars, it is not just us. It has to be spread around like peanut butter all over the place. I'm going to move on, but you look like you got a question.
Could you repeat that? Did you say our MPO usually gets X percent?
Yes,
What was the percent?
I believe I think it's 19%, 20%.
20%.
That sort of by agreement in the past, the money that comes into Region 2. So
I get it.
Yeah.
20% of it goes to our MPO, the 80% goes everywhere else.
it
including
goes everywhere
Pueblo.
else within Region 2, right? And then I'm not, and I don't think it's not a clean 20% for each of the 5. So Denver Region 1 might get, 40%, Region 2 might get, 15%, but we get 20% of the 15%. I'm making those numbers up, by the way, not the 20% part, but the other number.
But I misunderstood. I thought you meant in Region 2, our MPO inside Region 2 gets 20% of Region 2's funds. But
Yes.
that is true.
That is
But
true.
then it's also true that Region 2 gets 20% of the entire amount for the state.
And that's what I was saying. I don't know. I don't know what the distribution is, but I don't think it's an even 20% for
Okay.
each of the 5.
Okay.
I think Denver gets more.
They have established equity targets.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Ain't the word, but it's their word.
Right. It's their work. Yes.
What does that even mean? Established equity targets?
It,
Percentages, they have established.
They have
percentages.
established-
Why do we call it a percentage an equity target?
right.
Just
Yep. They've established the targets. And in this particular term, when you say equity, it's regional equity, it's geographic equity, not meaning anything else. And in that case, again, over a 5-year span, if one region gets more than their target, the next 5 years, they'll get less money to make it up. Then we wanted to add this one here, Colorado planning regions. This is, again, kind of off the topic of transportation, but as Andy was talking about SEDS, these are a lot of the economic sort of things. So you can see we're still luckily all together, Park, Teller, and El Paso County, but they've given us another number, and there's all these other sort of divisions in there, right? So this particular pie gets cut up 16 ways with 16 different sort of geographies. So again, not really transportation related, but I wanted to throw in here again, it's very hard sometimes for us to come together and say, what do we want and how do we want it? Because sometimes we have to invite some folks for some conversations and exclude other folks for other conversations. All right, and now, deep breath, going to talk about where the funding comes from. So again, as I've said before, spoiler alert, the money actually comes from you, the taxpayer, and it's collected in different forms, which we'll get to in a second, and it's there for all the different modes of transportation. So first, we'll sort of hit on the gas tax and the vehicle license tax. So in Colorado, the gas tax, when you go to the pump, you pay 18.4 cents in federal gas tax, and you'll pay 22 cents in Colorado gas tax. And once SB 260 sort of ramps all the way up, there'll be an additional 8 cents of sales tax because it's completely different, right? And we don't have to go through Tabor per gallon. So
where does 22 cents fall in the country? Is that like the middle? Is it the most? It's not the most expensive. Is it the least?
It's not. It's actually towards the lower side.
Okay.
So, in danger of having people throw stuff at me. Had you asked me before SB 260 where we're at, I would be like, I think we were in the bottom 10, right? Somewhere around 40th out of the 50 states. And I would say, we need to raise the gas tax. And yeah, I knew it, right? But I was, because again, it's if you want certain things,
Sure.
you got to pay for them. And I think most people are fine with if they know where it's going and it actually goes there. And transportation is one of those things that, as long as we don't play the shell game, they're actually okay with it if they see what the benefit is. And if you ask me, I'd say, well, if we could raise it a good 8 cents, that would be fine. So that's the weird thing about SB 260, is it actually raised the gas tax. Oh, excuse me, had an additional 8 cent sales tax in place, right? So it got us kind of on par of where we needed to be from a gas tax or a gas by gallon generation. However, it's all the other stuff, all the enterprises that were sort of the different part of it, and then the GHG thing that sort of did that. But that sales tax, while I sort of poke at them calling it a sales tax and not a real tax, it is something that has some value and isn't totally out of line when you look at the 50 states. All right, haven't lost you. No one threw anything that too heavy at me, so we'll keep going. On the federal side, that 18 cents. Again, you stop at this gas station and you pay. To be clear, the federal gas tax is actually collected at the refinery. So the Exxon and Gulf and all those other guys, they actually paid the tax already, but you're reimbursing them back for that tax when you pay at the pump. That money goes into the Highway Trust Fund, goes through the state, goes through Congress. They have what we call the surface transportation bills. Every 4 or 5 years, sometimes 6, it changes, adds or deletes funding sources, adds and deletes areas of focus. Our current bill is the PPACG stands for what? Infrastructure Investment Jobs Act. But before that, we had Safety, we had Safety Lou, we had Ice-T. They like to name them after me. We had MAP 21.
Those are all rappers, right?
Yeah.
Yes, I believe so.
50 cent.
Goes into the USDOT. They divvy it back then to the FTA, FHWA. And that comes into CDOT and then goes into the direct allocation to the MPOs. But then there's other allocations that go statewide for the state to spend anywhere with the state. That goes back to those sort of funding formulas that we touched on briefly. But for us here in the MPO, that's our STP Metro dollars, carbon reduction, and transportation alternatives dollars. And you'll see in a future slide, there are some state parallel funding sources that Danelle's going to talk about. On the state side, we have both not only does the taxpayer pay at the pump, but they also pay through their vehicle license tax. Some of the money then is distributed out under the Highway Users Trust Fund. That's where the cities, towns, and counties get their direct allocation. The rest goes to the state legislature under their Colorado revised statutes. They have a funding formula. Some of the money goes into the state highway fund that's controlled by the Colorado Transportation Commission. And then through CDOT comes back again to the whole state. Not anything specific to the MPOs of RPP, which I had mentioned, the faster, the maintenance, and then the multimodal options fund. MMOF is one that comes directly to the MPO that we work through our process and that you as the board of directors get to have a say on how that gets distributed. I think it's 85% of the money goes to the MPOs, and then there's 15% that goes to a statewide bucket that CDOT controls. Okay. Sales tax, again, I think we need to speed this up a little bit. So again, some of the jurisdictions have a sales tax. We've got PPRTA jurisdictions are paying in. Colorado Springs has the 2C. Woodland Park, within their existing, I believe it's 4 cents. I should have wrote down. I apologize. Written it. I should have written it down. But within their existing sales, their town sales tax, they've dedicated 1 cent of that towards transportation purposes. And then in the interest of time, I'm just going to fly through these. This goes back to that SB 260 and some of the the enterprises that were created. So we've got the road usage fee, which is again the sales tax you pay on gas, and it gets distributed to the cities, towns, and counties. And then you can see CDOT gets a pretty good chunk there. Bridge and tunnel impact fee. Again, the money is collected, I think, based on diesel and then comes back to the bridge and tunnel projects on a statewide basis. The road usage equalization fee, which is making sure that the folks who have hybrid vehicles pay
Don't say fair share.
no, something on parity to what it is. Because when they did this, they kind of figured out how much you would pay for an average car, and then they added that on to the alternate the hybrid vehicles. They took the existing electric vehicle fee and they upped that. The retail delivery fee, guys, kind of goes all over the place. You can see that goes some in the Highway User Trust Fund, Community Access, Bridge and Tunnel, Clean Transit for buses, the Clean Fleet Enterprise right there. Then there's the passenger ride fee, which is Uber and Lyft. Is this the one that gets distributed only to Denver and Boulder? I think there's one of these that, while it's collected statewide, is only eligible to be spent in areas of non-attainment, and currently that's Boulder and Denver. So we as a whole state pay into it, and then those two are the only ones that can actually tap into that. Now, if we go into non-attainment, we would be the third entity that would be able to get there.
Are you reckon?
As I said earlier, we can't get an Uber in Teller County anyway, so I guess it's okay.
I'm sorry. Okay,
Can you back up one slide, please?
sure.
And remind me that 27-cent fee, and it's beautiful pie, good colors, reminding us where all the project is supposed to go to, but how do you get the money?
So how do you get some of these monies? So the Highway User Trust Fund goes in and goes back out. The Clean Fleet, I believe that's the PPACG one. They collect the funds and they do an application process. So you would apply directly to them. Clean Transit, I think that's the CDOT one. Again, you would go through their application process to receive some of those funds. Bridge and Tunnel Enterprise, that goes back into that sort of that bigger fund that CDOT has. And I believe there's a Bridge and Tunnel Fund board that picks those projects. Multimodal Options Fund, that again, we do get a piece of. 85% goes to the NPOs, 15% goes to CDOT. So again, as we bring those in, as those funds come into our process, the jurisdictions within the NPO, sorry, can apply for those funds, and that's how you get that. If you're outside the NPO, you can go after the CDOT 15% funds, and there is a call for projects that CDOT handles with that.
I think did somebody put a comment in the chat?
Oh,
They did. Jeff Guthrie's been providing some stuff we can send out afterwards, just on the percentages and some of that information.
I object. None of this is true. All right. And I see we're almost at time. You know, when I time this out, I really thought I had plenty of time. Passenger ride fee. Again, that's Uber and Lyft. All right. So, and Andy, I don't know how you feel about this, but maybe we make this the last slide unless people want to hang out. We got a couple more topics. Otherwise, we could have make this the 101A and schedule again for a couple of months for the 101B.
I think that would be good, because I know we're going to lose about 5 members here in about 2 minutes or less.
And I think a perfect stopping
Yeah.
place would be after this slide. So
Yes.
we'll let Danelle take it home. Take it home, sister.
Yeah, and I think this is something we'd like to continue with every other month, quarterly, whatever we decide. Yeah.
So the list on this slide is really the funding types that you will see most commonly come to the board. The Surface Transportation Block Grant funding. That is funding that PPACG receives and gets to allocate a portion of the PPACG gets to allocate the funding that we receive. That's our most flexible funding source, and that's available for planning studies, road projects to include creating roads, creating more capacity. All of those kinds of things can fall into STP Metro funding. And that is available. The funding through PPACG is only available through the MPO. The next sort of funding is Transportation Alternatives Program. There's two pieces of funding here. There's a portion that does come through PPACG that's only available to the MPO. There's also a portion that goes through CDOT. So CDOT has its own call for projects, which is actually open right now. And that is available to anyone in the TPR as well as anybody in the MPO. And that funding is really for smaller scale transportation projects, pedestrian and bicycle facilities, primarily recreational trails, safe routes to school projects. Those sort of projects fall under TAP. And then there are also, as John mentioned, two pots of that multimodal options fund money. Again, we as PPACG get to designate some of where that goes. And that funding is, again, limited in its use primarily to non-roadway projects. The state actually has a set of its own specific goals that each project is supposed to try to fall within. Happy to send those out if that's of interest to anyone. The RPP funding, the Regional Priority Program, Regional Priority Project funding, that is CDOT kind of directs where that funding goes. However, the projects that goes to are those projects that our board designated for the 10-year plan. So those projects go into the CDOT 10-year plan, and then CDOT puts the funding toward those projects. And then the final one here on our slide is the Carbon Reduction Program funds. That is a new program that was started this year by the IIJA. We do get a portion of funding that comes through PPACG and is allocated through our committee process. And this funding is really designated to projects that are intended to reduce transportation emissions. And there's a whole list of eligibilities for each of these different programs that have been created by the FHWA. Happy to kind of go into some of those a little bit if you're interested, but in particular, Carbon Reduction Program is one that we've had to go to FHWA this year and say, is this specific project eligible for this program? Because it is new, we don't quite know all of the rules for it yet. So that's one we've had to reach out quite a bit for. And then there are other programs available, such as the Revitalizing Main Streets program, the Safe Routes to Schools program. Those are run through CDOT. You apply for funding directly through CDOT. And then, of course, there's a whole other slew of funds that are federal funds available through various grant programs through either USDOT or the EPA in some cases, various things. And those are some of the ones that hopefully Jill Gabler and Andy and I are kind of sifting through and hopefully trying to match up jurisdictions with some of those funding sources so that some of our local jurisdictions can go after some of them more easily. I know Colorado Springs, for instance, tends to apply for, they have this year, I think they called it a super call. They have 3 different pretty major transportation funding sources that were included in one application that Colorado Springs applied for. But there's all sorts of other little programs as well out there and new ones being created. So there's a lot. There's a lot to look at. There's a lot to sift through. But hopefully, I know that Jill has had meetings with several jurisdictions. I don't think she's been able to reach out to everybody yet, but that is something that we're working on, trying to get people's priorities and then use that as the starting place for building that out in the future.
If I could mention something about that real quick, appreciate Danelle bringing that up. We've got a meeting with the city, town, county managers tomorrow, and we're going to talk about this specifically to make sure we know who the point person is within each jurisdiction. So we're not having to connect with like 3 or 4 different people that may have 3 or 4 different priorities. So yeah, just wanted to let you know that's in the works.
Any questions on any of these? I'm happy to answer questions, or we can send out any follow-up information, but that's really, I think, what we had for this today.
If I could, Madam Chair, no questions, but I would recommend we just pick this up again next month rather than waiting 2 months or quarterly. It's excellent information, and I think I'd like to just keep going with it.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think through my mind because we had several months in a row kind of stuff set out. I can't remember if we had something already planned for April.
April.
Transit meeting.
No, we were going to do a transit follow-up meeting after our April board meeting.
Yeah.
That's right. So we'll talk. So we might either pick this up at the board workshop in April, the Friday pre-meeting. If possible, we'll put our heads together, but I agree. We want to keep the momentum going here for sure. Yes, we'll see if we can either weave it into the regular board April meeting or the pre-workshop meeting. Yeah.
Is that okay? Does that work for you?
On our calendar invites, the board meeting goes till 12. Does it actually only go till 11 now?
So originally PPACG went from 9 to 11. Over the last 3 years, it's just kind of been getting longer and longer. So I think we budgeted till 12, but we'd like to keep the meetings to 11 because I know looking around the room after 2 hours, people are starting to kind of glaze over. So that's one of the, so it is. And then we thought if people wanted to, and that people have other meetings to get to. And so we just were hoping to get it back, kind of rein it back in to be to 11. And then if we had meetings like this or other discussions that needed to happen afterwards, it gave us the time before running into the RTA meeting that begins at 1:30 and getting staff time to have lunch.
If the transit meeting is at just a few people, and
It is, yeah. And we'll see if we can maybe
then
find
maybe
another
that can be
date.
done
That's an option.
at a
Yep.
different time and just
Mhm.
run this at 11 o'clock. I think this is a great time to do
Yep.
it, but however it works out, it's good.
We'll figure it out. Yeah. We will keep this conversation going in April, one way or another.
Thank you. Anybody else? Good suggestion. Thank you. I don't see any hands online. When will this be available for people to review it? The link for the meeting, couple
We'll s-
days, you'll send us out a link? No,
Well-
I'm saying couple,
Yeah,
couple days,
at
I'll
the-
be in 2-3 days.
Well, one thing we're trying to do at the risk of overloading you with a bunch of different emails coming from us at different times, what I'd like to do is Jared and I will coordinate and we'll blast out one email later today, or if not today, first thing tomorrow morning with a handful of things we're going to follow up on, like the mobility guide and just the legislative bill list and things like that. And we'll attach the presentation here today as well. So stand by. It's coming later today, hopefully.
So if someone is not on that email blast and they want to watch this meeting, like I know I had some staff members that said they already had meetings today, but they really want to go back and watch it because they're trying to really learn the information. Where will people access it? Will it be on the website or?
So just like we do with all of our meetings, we'll post them on our YouTube channel.
Okay,
For public meetings, I do try to get them up by this time tomorrow. Board meetings are a little unique because my poor hard drive, I've got PPACG and PPRTA, and plus this, so I will prioritize this. We'll try to get this up tomorrow morning. I don't want to promise today, just because it's a long day of.
Sure.
and will it follow at the end of the regular meetings or they can just kind of?
This
go
will be a
through the-
standalone.
This will be a standalone. Okay,
Yep.
all right, great.
Yeah, we'll get the slides out sooner, but the link to the actual discussion today, a little bit, might be later in the day tomorrow or so.
sure.
Yeah.
I'm going 2 or 3 days, so. All right. Okay, any other questions? If not, thank you very much. Appreciate it.